Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I am Deepak, your host from India. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Poornima Luthra, Principal Lecturer in People, Culture and Inclusion at Imperial College London, as our distinguished guest on today's episode. Before we get started, I would like to introduce the guest for today's episode. Dr. Poornima Luthra is an award-winning author, keynote and TEDx speaker, an internationally respected scholar, practitioner in talent management and equity, diversity and inclusion. Drawing on nearly 2 decades of research and teaching across Asia and Europe, she blends academic insight with practical impact. An author of 4 acclaimed books, including Can I Say That? And The Art of Active Allyship, and a contributor to Harvard Business Review. Dr. Poornima advises global organizations like Carlsberg, Lego, Deloitte, and Medicine Sans Frontiers. Recognized by Thinkers 50 as one of the world's rising management thinkers, her work continues to shape modern conversations on inclusive leadership and equitable workplace culture. In today's episode, Professor Poornima Luthra shares key insights from her acclaimed book, Can I Say That? Your go-to guide for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Professor Poornima Luthra to the conversation. Professor Poornima, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. Thank you for graciously accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much, Deepak. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Professor, your book starts from a very human place, and that is fear. What are the most common fears you see people carrying into DEI conversations? And how do they silently shape our behavior at work?
Yeah. I think when we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, you could say that it has had its own journey since 2020. Many organizations, with the murder of George Floyd in the US, really started putting diversity, equity, and inclusion on the table. And since then, we have seen both an upsurge of organizations prioritizing DEI within their HR and people practices and strategy. And we've also, at the same time, since 2025, really seen a backlash to DEI as well. So I've spent some time over the last about 3 years really trying to study this backlash. And I think it's important to say that the backlash isn't new. It's not just in the past 2 to 3 years that we've seen it. Backlash has always been there. If you go back to the early women's rights movements in like the early 1900s, or you think about the race movements around the world, there's always been some degree of backlash to these movements. Now, some of them are more overt and they make media presence, they're well known. Others are more subtle. So I think it's important to put on the table that backlash and what you're describing, that emotion of fear, is something that has always been there. It's just that we have perhaps not labeled it as such. So this was something I was really curious. I didn't land up in my research with starting with fear. It was actually a curiosity to understand where this backlash actually comes from. And what's really interesting is prior research shows us that people see DEI as a threat to someone's status, to the opportunities that they've had, to even this very idea of merit or meritocracy, to their culture. And so I was really curious to understand that in the event of a threat, as human beings, we react with emotions. A threat response comes in. And so what were those emotions at play is what I wanted to really understand. So I did quite a lot of research around trying to understand these emotions. And it turns out there's quite a host of emotions that come up. Everything from feeling overwhelmed, insecure, inadequate, this anxiety. So there's quite a lot of emotions. And when you look at all those emotions put together, we can trace it back, again, looking at scholarly work around emotions, it comes back to the core human emotion of fear. And so then I was, of course, curious about, well, what are we actually fearful of? Not just that we see it as a threat, but where does this fear actually lie? Now, when it comes to DEI, there are really 5 fears that many of us experience. And I want to caveat this by saying that it's not just people who are anti-DEI that experience fear. Even those of us like myself who are in the field, who are advocating for fairness in organizations and workplace and society, that we also experience fear. So the 5 fears that my research shows is, number 1, that we're fear actually of change. We have a fear of change. that, all of this means that we need to do things differently. We need to challenge the ways in which things have been done in our organizations, or even more broadly in society, that we need to question some of the processes that we have in our organizations that favor some people and not others. At the same time, it means that we're leveling the playing field, which means that we're not just competing with the same people we were competing before. Suddenly, the talent pool of competent, capable, experienced talent is now suddenly wider. So all of this creates change, it creates uncertainty, and we have a fear of that. That's the first one. The second one is a fear of discomfort. That at the end of the day, there is a real discomfort with coming to terms with the idea that I am actually biased, that everybody is biased, right? It's simply how our brain functions. But we don't really like that. I think there's a fear that we have of coming to terms with this idea, this discomfort that, oh my gosh, I am actually biased. And in being silent, I am actually complicit with allowing discrimination and bias systems to continue to exist. And then it's the fear of vulnerability, that this requires me to do things differently, to say that I don't know, that I need to do and understand that. And very often we think of leaders in our organizations as the all-knowing, that they're supposed to know things and they're supposed to have the answers to things. But DEI questions all of that, and it helps us to think about, well, what is it that we actually do know? What is our strengths, and where's our vulnerability? So there's a fear of that vulnerability. And then it comes to more people working with really this idea that we are really fearful about, that we're not making adequate progress, right? That we take 2 steps forward and almost seems like we're taking 5 steps back. The fear of adequate progress, but also the fear of really, in many ways, this idea that, how can I describe it really kind of very succinctly? We're fearful of getting things wrong, but we're also fearful of being labeled. I think many of us working in this space are really fearful of, all right, you're now the DEI police, right? You're walking into the room and now suddenly everyone has to be politically correct about what they're saying, what they're doing. So I think there's a lot of these fears at play. So really this idea, fear of change, fear of getting it wrong, fear of that vulnerability or discomfort, the fear of being labeled, and the fear of really not making enough progress. Yeah.
Focusing describe, can I say that, as a safe space to learn about DEI? In very
Yeah.
practical terms, what does a psychologically safe DEI conversation look like and feel like in a team meeting?
Yeah. I think one of the things that has happened with DEI is that it has created some polarization. Either you are for it or against it. And unfortunately, that hasn't allowed for space for people to really express their concerns about it. That is it being done in a way that's actually fair? Is it addressing the issues at hand? And a lot of times DEI is painted as a zero-sum game. That means, for example, if we put women on the table and we're prioritizing hiring women, for example, or promoting women, that there's an underlying assumption that it's at the expense of men. And that, of course, creates polarization. And when the focus should be on, are our processes fair? Are we actually casting the net far and wide? Do we have adequate talent pool? Are we prioritizing some talent pools over others when they could be equally or even more competent? Who are we really missing out on? In team meetings, does everyone have a fair chance? Are there very dominant voices within team settings? Whose voice is really missing? And really understanding those dynamics. So when we talk about psychologically safe environments in teams, what we're really referring to is creating space for dialogue. Creating space. Right now, there's a lot of debate culture in our organizations. We've been trained through education systems, etc., to debate issues out. And with debating, you have to take a stand. You're either for or against the motion at play. And yet life isn't about being for or against. There's so much nuance. There's so many gray areas that we need to be having conversations about. And yet when things are painted as a debate, then people have to take a stand. And the challenge with taking a stand is, even if you start with saying, okay, I'm going to take a stand, and I'm going to be curious, eventually in a debate culture, you go deeper and deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole of defending your stance, and we stop being curious. So I'd love for people to move from debates to dialogue. So can I say that one of the things I really advocate there is the idea that in our team settings, even in regular conversations by the coffee machine at lunch during meetings, that we should be having dialogues. We need to come to the table with asking curious questions, saying, it's interesting you hold that perspective. Where are you coming from? What evidence might you have to support that view? Can I offer a different perspective here? Can we have that dialogue? Can we hold space for that? It's not that we're always going to agree. And I think human beings need to understand that we don't always have to agree, but we do need to have space for those conversations so that more people feel heard rather than feeling silenced, either way, depending on what your views are, right? And I think that we have a very binary way of looking at topics, and that comes from that debate culture I've talked about. And we need to move away from that to hold space for conversations that are more nuanced. And I think that is where the practice of asking curious questions to say, it may be triggering and it might be something that someone says that you fundamentally don't believe in. But I think it's important for us to say, where are you coming from? What has led you to believe or have that worldview, that life experience? What in your life has led you to that? Or what evidence or statistics or data are you using to support that? And in that process, hopefully you're also able to help the other person see your point of view. But I don't think we have enough of that conversation, especially around polarizing topics like DEI.
Professor, many listeners worry about saying the wrong thing or being cancelled, so they stay silent. How do you help people move from silence to avoidance to curious, accountable engagement?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest fears is the fear of getting it wrong. And we have a culture, as you've talked about as well, of canceling people, that the minute they don't are not aligned with either our own views or perhaps the views of the wider narrative that is going on, that we cancel them. And what cancel means is that we basically void their voice, right? We ask them or we communicate in a way that suggests that their voice is not valid or their view is not valid. And I think that creates this feeling that we are walking around eggshells, that we're constantly worried, am I saying the right thing? But also, am I doing the right thing? I think when I work with leaders in organizations, one of the things I hear very often is leaders who say, I want to do more. I know that our organizational processes are not entirely fair. I know that there's talent out there that I'm not capitalizing on. I know that we can be more innovative if we had talent from a different industry, from a different skill set. And yet they are afraid of actually acting on it because they're afraid that what if I misstep? What if I say something wrong? I believe in it, but I'm not sure I necessarily have all the knowledge available. And this is a real challenge in our organizations, that we assume that people need to know everything. And yet this is an evolving field. So we have to also allow for people to make mistakes and for us to come to the table to say, hey, I think what you said or did the other day, I think for some people it might have been perceived that way, or it might have caused harm to someone. It would be great for us to have a conversation about it and how you could frame that differently and what you could do differently. We don't allow enough space for mistakes. And I think that that's a real challenge for us. Failure and learning from these things needs to be part and parcel of our culture, with the intention that in that process, we are learning, we are growing, we are doing things differently, we're challenging systems and cultures around us. And that needs to be the attitude that we have. But I understand, even I sometimes feel fearful. Have I got the right terminology? What have I not read up on? Especially if it's not part of my own identity. If I'm reflecting on or I'm speaking on behalf of, or I'm advocating for someone I don't share their life experience. I also feel that moment of, okay, do I know enough about this to be able to talk that through? But I think it's also a lot of, if you think about very practical things, it's about making sure that we are also self-educating, that, when we don't know, there's a wealth of information out there that we can actually access. This is not like 20 years ago when I started doing my research, that so much of this knowledge and resources were behind paywalls. They were not accessible. They were not written in language that was understandable necessarily to wider audiences. But today that's not the case, right? There's so much more awareness. And so there is a responsibility that I do think we need to put on ourselves and on others to self-educate. That if you don't know, find out. And if you've made a mistake, sit with that. One of my favorite phrases, and I'm happy for your listeners to adopt it as well, is when my biases are called out, I use the phrase good catch. And it's a really lovely way just to diffuse that tension, because the minute your bias is pointed out, the first instinctive nature is your ego comes into play, right? You come into the picture saying, oh, no, but I'm not biased. I'm a good person. I try to be fair. I have friends from this community, or, we try to in many ways to defend ourselves. To resist that, I think good catch is a really lovely phrase that really stops that defense mechanisms from kicking in, and also create space for a conversation, saying, good catch, I hadn't thought of it that way. Thanks for pointing it out. It looks like I have some work to do on this. And that's an easy way of creating and role modeling the kind of response systems we want to be able to have. Yeah.
Professor, the book goes beyond the usual focus on gender and race to a much broader, intersectional view of diversity. Can you share an example that shows why this wider lens fundamentally changes how we design inclusion?
Yeah. So a lot of my work, this idea of intersectionality goes back to the 1960s with Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality. Now, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw really studied the intersection of race and gender with Black women in the American context. Now, my first book, Diversifying Diversity, which came out in 2020, really looks very deep into 12 dimensions, which I've over time expanded into 15 dimensions, which really look at the very idea, and the basic premise is that human beings do not show up at work in one or two dimensions. We are complex beings. Our identity is complex, and our identity is not just attributed to gender or to race or to age. It is so much more than that. It is also the cognitive aspects of our educational background, the skills and expertise we have, our personality, neurodiversity, mental health, socioeconomic background, our parenthood and parenthood or marital choices that we make, our cultural background, which might be different from just race or ethnicity, but thinking about a cultural background. There's so much at play here. Disabilities, right? And this visible disabilities. There's so much there that makes up who we are, what I call a diversity thumbprint. So when organizations design inclusion within their culture, within their processes, it is simplistic in many ways for them to look at one or two dimensions. And the problem with looking at one or two dimensions is that we then simplify something that is very complex. And then in doing so, we actually do an injustice to the actual very idea of what we're trying to achieve. And we create this zero-sum game. We create this polarization, because at the end of the day, people who are not covered by those one or two dimensions end up feeling like this is not for me. And yet in the ideal sense, what we're trying to do in an organization environment is to make our processes fair, is to really, really scrutinize the process that we have. So for example, if we're looking at the employee life cycle, it's really thinking at every single step, whether it's the job description, whether it's your interview panels, how you shortlist, what opportunities are given to people in talent development. If it's thinking about your design processes for products and services, thinking about the voices that we're including in marketing campaigns as well. It's all of these processes in our organizations. It's about scrutinizing it and saying, are we genuinely being fair? Do we have enough mechanisms in places, what I call nudges in places, that people who are making decisions at the various points through these processes, do they really have that ability to have clarity around this? Are they being nudged to question their biases and other people's biases that might be embedded in how they look at people and decisions that they're making, information and evidence that they're looking at? And asking those questions: whose voice are we missing out on? What evidence do we need to collect? And really, really being fair as possible. Look, we can't. I think there's also, it's a question of, can we have all information at all times? No, right? So we're working, yes, within limited information, but we can do due diligence and make sure that we have as much information so that we're making as robust and fair a decision as possible. And I think that is what we need to be really focusing on. And in that process, if we prioritize one or two dimensions, we will leave out people along the journey and we will alienate. And that creates this backlash, this discomfort, this resistance that we're seeing. So intersectionality for me is fundamental because human beings don't show up. You and I don't show up with only our binary gender identities or our race. We show up with so much more than that, you know. So you would show up with our age. It might be our sexual orientation. It might be our educational background and expertise. It might be socioeconomic background. It might be the cultural nuances, citizenship as well. Nationality comes into the picture. It might be neurodiversity. It might be personality. So many things, right? And we don't leave a part of this outside or we shouldn't at least leave a part of this outside our organization's doors before we come in. And that's what I really try to focus on, is trying to look at a lens to say that our processes need to be robust enough and broad enough in many ways to be able to address discrimination and bias across these lenses.
Professor, you write about 4 possible responses to fear and 5 nudges to let go of DEI fears. Which response do you encounter most often in organizations? And what is one nudge that reliably helps people shift?
It's always so hard to put it down to one nudge, right? I think, you know, when it comes to what really works, I think I always start with curiosity. I think curiosity is one of those things that, you know, in the absence of curiosity, is very difficult for us to do anything else. So we have to start with that curiosity to pause. I think very often when we engage, especially on difficult topics, right? We all sit around at work, but also at home, right? And with family members, with friends, perhaps, you know, and the minute someone says something that is a very different viewpoint from our own, what is our instinct? Our instinct is to get defensive, is to challenge, to get into that debate mindset. So the first step, the first pause is curiosity, the first nudge. Like, hang on, can I be curious? Can I ask a question that is grounded in curiosity? Where are you coming from? How do you see this? What evidence do you have that suggests this? Are you saying this? Because I think sometimes we make assumptions that when someone says something, that we are assuming that it is against us or against someone like us or a particular group, but they may not have actually intended it to be that way. So asking for clarification also may be make it known that, you know, the way they said something might have come across a particular way that they may not have intended to, but it might have actually come across a particular way. And to say, is that what you really meant? You know, and coming to the table with that curiosity, I think is so important. You know, people communicate in different ways, and that can create a lot of tension and misunderstanding. So for me, if there's one nudge that I would love people to start with, is really curiosity. And that relates to what I talked about earlier, that dialogue, right? That curiosity leading to dialogue.
Professor, privilege in your work is described as fluid and contextual rather than fixed. How do you invite people who resist the word privilege to see their own advantages without triggering shame or defensiveness?
Yeah. And I think, you know, this is a problem with media, right? How we portray a particular word. Now, the word itself, privilege, doesn't have any negative connotations to it. And yet, we associate it with something that we should be ashamed of. So the narratives around privilege are around shame, around, you know, canceling people who have privilege. And so there's a lot of fear about the very word privilege. And the way that I work with privilege is I start off with saying, well, what is privilege? Privilege is all the things that I don't need to consider or think about that someone else has to consider. It is all the things that I don't need to pay attention to that someone else has to. And when we reframe privilege in that context, and also maybe as a synonym, offer the synonym of advantage. What advantages do I have? Some of those advantages are earned advantages. So if you've studied, if you've had a higher degree, for example, they are earned advantages, right? There could be others that are unearned advantages, where you're born, to which family, what nationality you hold, what socioeconomic background your family is from, which then opens up or does not open up opportunities, networks, education, healthcare access. All of those things are unearned by ourselves. They might have been earned by our parents and generations before us, but it's not our own earning. We have inherited that in many ways, right? And they either give us an advantage or a disadvantage. And I think that when you frame things these ways, I think people really, they're able to sit with it. But I also do activities with leaders, right? I think there are a number of activities that I run within my leadership workshops where leaders have an opportunity to engage in what is known as kinesthetic exercises, where they have to take on a role playing, right? You take on a role that removes that immediate possible attack on my own privilege to saying that now I'm a character. And based on the character and how do I experience workplaces, right? It could also be, there's a wonderful activity where you reflect on certain statements and you say, do I experience it this way or that way? And based on that, you reflect on, yeah, I've got advantages in these areas that other people simply don't. And I think that's very humbling. So the reframe. So I like to reframe privilege in that sense that it's all the things I don't need to think about that someone else has to, right? And it is also this idea that privilege should be seen as, in many ways, as a source of power, a source of strength for us to do things differently, to lift others, to pay it forward, to address systemic bias, to make our workplaces fairer and a level playing field. It is our responsibility when we have privilege, when we have those advantages, to do more to challenge where discrimination exists.
Professor, the book offers concrete tools for allyship. If a listener wanted to start practicing active allyship this week, what are the 2 or 3 specific behaviors we would ask them to experiment with?
Yeah. So I think allyship first needs to be defined. I think that's important. And what active allyship actually means needs to be defined. I, of course, have a book on this topic that dives deep into what is active allyship. The title of the book is The Art of Active Allyship. And how I define allyship is that it is not a one-off. It is a lifelong process of building and supporting relationships and challenging systems for those who are from underrepresented, marginalized, discriminated groups. And the purpose, of course, of allyship and active allyship in particular is to advance inclusion. Now, with this definition, it's important to say that allyship is really about making progress in the long run, right? We often start off with being an ally to people who are more similar to us. It might be something that's just a little bit different that we're comfortable with providing them support. Or challenging systems for some people who are closer to us in identity than others. But allyship is really that lifelong process of challenging ourselves to really be able to challenge systems, cultures for people who are very different from us, who have completely different life experiences. And if you look at active allyship, the vast majority of us are actually passive. We might engage in a little bit of behaviors here and there, but active allyship is about consistency and frequency. It needs to be something that we do frequently and we do consistently, and it needs to be lifelong. I think if we keep that in mind, then we can start thinking about, well, what are the behaviors with active allyship? I think I'll focus on some of my behaviors that I talk about within a team setting, right? I think that's probably very relevant to many of our listeners. Many of us spend a lot of our time working within team environments. I think there are a couple of very practical things we can do in teams, and I'll talk about 3 of them. Number 1 is, before any decision is being made, ask yourselves and others, what evidence are we missing and whose voice is missing? So whose voice is relevant to the decision we're making, but we haven't considered. So for example, it might be a team member who has expertise in a particular area, but their voice hasn't been heard. The dominant voices, it's often said, right, and it's the 80-20 rule, I guess, but it's often said that there's a small number of voices that dominate the vast majority of conversations in teams. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, whose voices have not been heard, but they have expertise. We know that they are experts in this, yet their voice hasn't been heard. Or we might have looked for evidence that's easy. We need to make a decision quickly. We're looking for the quick answer. We look for evidence that supports our pre-held beliefs, confirmation bias. So what evidence do we need to look for that's contrarian to this even, so that we can make sure that our decision, whichever way it goes, is actually robust, that we've considered that. That's number one. Whose voices or evidence do we need to look into? The second, in team dynamics, what is also really important is ensuring that, when you talk about whose voices are missing, how do we make that happen? And so, you in a team meetings, not everyone is willing to put up their hand and say, I have a viewpoint, and to offer that in plenary. Now, there are many reasons for this, right? It could be personality, right? Some people prefer one-on-one conversations. Others are extroverted and dominate conversations. But it also could be cultural differences. A lot of us work across culturally diverse teams, which means that we have different ways of communicating. And for some, depending on the cultures we're from, we might be looking for moments of silence. And if people are speaking over each other, those moments never come. And so voices get drowned in that. So I think the responsibility on someone within the team, a team facilitator, a team leader, is to seek out these opinions and voices and expertise in advance. So if you know that there is a topic coming up in a meeting, send the agenda out in advance, write to the relevant people and say, hey, I know you have a lot to say about this topic. Can we have a quick 30-minute catch up prior to that? I'd love to hear your opinion. At the end of that discussion, you can say, look, I think what your views are and expertise and research, etc., that you are bringing to the table is so important for us. I would like to support you at the meeting coming up on Thursday, for example. I would like you to share what you've just shared with me. And if the person says, no, I'm not really comfortable in that kind of setting, you can say, well, I'm happy to share it for you, but I'll give credit to you, right? And so the person's voice is still brought into, the right expertise is coming in. We're not losing out on people's voices. And hopefully over time, we create psychologically safe environments where someone feels that they can contribute, that we're creating moments of silence, that we're allowing space for more junior, for example, employees, generationally different employees as well, to have input into the decisions that we're making. And then I think the other one is, in our teams, very often two things happen. One is people get interrupted a lot. And number two is people take credit for other people's work. This happens surprisingly often. It happens more often for some groups than others. If we're looking at just gender, there's plenty of research that shows us that women experience both of these much more significantly than men do. Now, of course, in team settings, interruptions are a natural part of how conversations happen. And if you have cultures where people tend to speak more spontaneously, as someone's view is kind of drowning out, the next person takes over. That's a very natural interruption. And yet there are others where people are intentionally being cut off. So they might have offered or started to offer something and they're intentionally cut off. Those are the ones I'm really concerned about here. That, when you notice that happening, divert the conversation back. Say, I don't think so-and-so had finished saying their view. We'll come back to you when they're done. So it's a polite way, it's respectful to both parties. Someone might have been just enthusiastic and they've cut someone else off. Or it could be habitual as well, right? Or intentional. Either way, you are in a very polite way sending a message that in our teams, we will make sure that people's voices are heard, and that creates psychological safety, right? On the other hand, there's often also the situations where someone offers a perspective and an opinion based on their work experience, and someone else rephrases that and they get credit for it, and the other person is ignored, right? In those situations, again, being hyper vigilant about this to say, oh, I'm so glad you agree with so-and-so's opinion that they shared earlier. I'm glad you're bringing it up again. I think what they said had a very valid point to what we're discussing here today. Again, you're redirecting stolen credit back. Again, it sends a message that, hang on, you can't take credit for someone else's thoughts and opinions expertise that is being shared. I think these are very practical things that we can look out for. And, sometimes when we listen to some of these very practical things that we think, surely we all do these already. Start observing. When you start observing your team, you'll be surprised how much of this, that we're not looking for all evidence, that not all voices are heard, the number of times people get interrupted unnecessarily, or the number of times credit is taken from someone, that number of times that leaders are simply not putting in the effort to seek out those perspectives and expertise.
Professor, you emphasize slowing down our minds and reactions, opening our hearts and leaning into others. Why is this slow thinking so critical for inclusive decision making in high pressure business environments?
Yeah. I mean, this is based on a lot of Daniel Kahneman's work, which really looks at this idea that, we make about 35,000 decisions a day. His book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is really a very powerful book that helps us understand that we are making a very large number of decisions. Most of us, and I'm sure many of your listeners, like you and me, are not aware of 35,000 decisions that we're making. So we engage as human beings, and how our brain functions is that we engage in system one thinking, quick, intuitive decision making. And that is that fast, reactionary decision making. It's only 5% of the time that we slow down our decision making, that we take time to make a decision. Now, what I encourage people, myself as well, and leaders around me, employees that I'm working with, is where do we use that 5%? First of all, are we using it adequately, right? Are we actually using 5% and making the effort to slow down? And at the same time, where are we channeling that, right? So where are the important points of decisions in our day, in our week, in our month, in our year, where we believe we have to slow things down? And I think sometimes in team settings, it's helpful to have that person wearing that hat who says, hang on, let's take a pause. The pause doesn't always need to be many days. Sometimes it's just that quick pause to say, what are we missing out on? What evidence? What do we need more? Have we considered everything? That's that pause that I'm talking about. And more often than not, we might say, maybe we do have all the evidence. Great. And we feel confident that we're making a robust decision. But we might at other times say, actually, we need to go and speak to this particular team in the organization, or our suppliers, or our customers. We need to gather more information about this before we make a decision. And I know that in our fast-paced organizations, leaders are under so much pressure, right? Both from meeting their KPIs or OKRs to their, constant scrutiny around monthly or quarterly results to making decisions quickly. But if we slow down and think more medium term, that some of these decisions that we're making in the short term might be like, yeah, let's just do it. But in the medium term, they might have consequences that are less than ideal because we haven't considered A, B, and C. We've only considered X, Y, and Z. But if we take that time, and often that pause is shorter than people think. I think people often assume that the pause is a long pause. No, sometimes it's a short pause. But in that short pause, we're then taking into account A, B, and C, and we're making a decision that will be more beneficial in both the short term, but also the medium and potentially even the long term.
Professor, some people fear that DEI conversations will escalate into conflict. How can leaders hold space for disagreement while still protecting those who are most marginalized in the room?
Yes, and I think that one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that DEI conversations need to be centered. Like very often we center it on ourselves or people like us because that's comfortable. Where at the end of the day, we're humans, and humans like to protect. We're, our animal instinct, if you like, kicks in, the survival instinct. We want to protect us and our own, people who are like us, right? And we need to resist that instinct in us. We don't live in an in a wild kingdom in many ways where we've evolved, which means that none of us are in a position where we are out in the wild, so to speak, right? In our workplaces, we have that capacity to decenter ourselves and to center others who are marginalized. And I think that that is a responsibility we have. Now, sometimes when people hear this, they might think, oh, that's lowering the standards. That is giving space to people who may not be as competent. That's not what we're talking about. We need people who are qualified and competent, and there are plenty of people who come from discriminated, marginalized backgrounds who are equally, I reiterate, equally, and many times even more competent than the dominant groups. And it's about making sure that we are creating those spaces, those safe, fair spaces for them to be included, for them to thrive in our organizational environments, and for them to progress. And everybody, the thing about DEI is that when we paint it in the way it's been villainized, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion is villainized. But we think about the core of what these terms mean. Diversity is about uniqueness. You and I want to be recognized for what we bring uniquely to the table, right? Equity is about fairness, and inclusion is about this deep sense of belonging. And Maslow's hierarchy and research shows us that as human beings, we want to belong. So no matter who you meet on whichever political side of they sit on, wherever they sit on the spectrum of political views, everybody wants to feel this. They want to be valued for their uniqueness. They want fairness, right? They may not believe in the same way of getting to fairness, but the very principle that the world should be fair is something that most people would agree with. And the last one is everyone wants to feel like they belong. And that is the misunderstanding that we have about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that it is somehow about favoring some groups, it's a zero-sum game, it is lowering the bar or standards, it is not meritocratic. There's a lot of myths around this that we need to debunk. So I often go back to the core. What are we talking about here? That when we talk about lifting discriminated, marginalized groups, what are we saying? We're saying that we want a world and our workplaces to value uniqueness because it adds business value, right? It means that our teams are thriving. It means we're making more innovative decisions. That only adds positive to the bottom line, to the long run of the company. We want fairness. We want to ensure that our processes are actually fair. I'm not a fan of the term merit and meritocracy because in itself, these terms are also loaded terms. And they are, who do we consider to have merit? There's a lot of bias embedded within that. There's research that shows if you ask someone who they think of when they think of someone brilliant, right? A certain type of person comes to our mind. So these words are very highly biased terms, but we want fairness, right? And we want that sense of belonging. I want to belong. I want to be a part of my team, my organization, society, community more broadly. Right? That is the fundamentals of it. And if we come down to that, I think it's much easier to get people along the journey.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. You talk about DEI as a shared opportunity rather than a threat. What would it look like in everyday employees who don't want to be the only ones fighting for change, collectively embrace stealth mode or everyday DEI?
Yeah, I think start with the small things. I think sometimes when we think about this work, we think, oh, it's overwhelming. And even sometimes I can empathize with that. I also feel that way, that so much needs to change. We're talking about systems and structures that have been built by maybe ourselves or previous generations before us, but it sometimes seems so overwhelming. But one thing I'd love to leave the listeners with is that we all have a sphere of influence. People within our teams that we're working with more regularly, colleagues that we go to lunch with, people we meet at the coffee machine, right? Even outside of work, friends that we socialize with, family members. These are all opportunities for us to come with that curiosity, to ask people questions, to understand what assumptions they hold, and ask questions that help them to see the world in a different way. I think if we start with that curiosity and creating space for that dialogue, I think we can go a long way. But I also really would love for people not to be apathetic, to think that, oh, what can I do? I'm one person. If everyone believed that, would never make progress. And if we look at human history, whenever progress has been made, right, it is because people believed that they could do something within their own spheres of influence. And I'm a firm believer in the ripple effect. If you drop a pebble into a pond, it has that ripple effect. So we start with us, we influence the people around us, no matter how small that is, but influence the people around us, ask those questions, create space for dialogue, psychologically safe spaces. And in turn, they will also do it to their own spheres of influence. And I think that if there is one thing I'd love for people to, walk away with after listening to this, is you have a sphere of influence. So do what you can within your own sphere to challenge yourselves and challenge others around how we look at the world around us. Is there a different way to look at it?
Thank you, Dr. Poornima Luthra, for sharing your research insights from your publication and for this engaging conversation. We truly appreciate your time and perspectives, and we look forward to learning more from your work in the near future. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Deepak. Thank you for having me.